What if the harshest punishment wasn't inflicted on your body, but on your mind? In the depths of medieval castles, oubliettes were built to erase prisoners from memory, stripping away hope, identity, and even the sense of time itself. These dungeons were more than just cells. They were instruments of psychological torment, designed to induce dread, despair, and madness in total darkness. Centuries before anyone understood the effects of isolation, these pits forced captives into a world without light, sound, or human contact. The horror of the oubliette lay not in visible wounds, but in the slow unraveling of the mind. To understand how these spaces worked, we must first look at their chilling design and the intent behind their creation. Hidden beneath the stone floors of medieval castles, oubliettes represented a punishment so severe that even the most hardened captives dreaded their name. Unlike standard prison cells, these spaces were not meant to restrain, but to erase. The shaft was narrow, often barely wide enough for a person to stand, and plunged deep into the earth, accessible only by a trapdoor high above. Once the opening closed, the prisoner was cut off from the world. No light, no sound, no hope of rescue. The architecture itself was a tool of psychological warfare, engineered to ensure that escape, and even memory, became impossible. The name says it all. Oubliette comes from the French word for to forget, and that was the point. The people sent here were meant to disappear, not just from the castle above, but from history itself. The dimensions of these dungeons varied, but the effect was always the same. Some shafts were so tight that prisoners couldn't sit or stretch out, forced to stand for days or weeks. Others landed on cold stone, or worse, in stagnant water or atop the remains of earlier victims. The initial drop through the trapdoor was abrupt, but the true descent began in the hours and days that followed, as the prisoner realized that no one would come and nothing would change. Inside the oubliette, the senses quickly failed. Darkness was absolute. Even after hours, no shapes or outlines emerged. Sound was reduced to the slow drip of water or the distant scurry of rats. The air was thick with dampness and the stench of decay. With no natural light and no way to mark the passage of time, days blurred together. Survival became a matter of enduring the mental strain, not just the physical discomfort. Many prisoners lost track of reality, unsure if they'd been trapped for hours or weeks. There are records from the medieval period describing the effects of this isolation. One 14th century account tells of a captive who, after only a few days, began screaming uncontrollably. By the time guards checked the oubliette, the prisoner had retreated into silence, rocking in a corner, his mind fractured by the experience. No physical torture was needed. The oubliette's design did all the work. This was not accidental. Medieval jailers understood, even without modern psychology, that isolation breaks people in ways that pain alone cannot. By depriving prisoners of all sensory input and social contact, the oubliette forced the mind to turn inward. Hallucinations, paranoia, and despair were common. Today, we know that solitary confinement can cause lasting psychological harm, but centuries ago, the architects of these dungeons relied on instinct and observation. The oubliette's cruelty lay in its slow, methodical destruction of identity and hope. Physical hardship added another layer. The cold seeped into bones, and the damp stone walls never dried. Sometimes food was tossed down from above, moldy scraps crawling with insects, barely enough to survive. In many cases, prisoners received nothing at all. The deprivation was total. No comfort, no dignity, no sense of self. Even the act of eating became a humiliation, another reminder of how far they had fallen. The legacy of the oubliette lingers. Modern solitary confinement still isolates prisoners in small, featureless cells with minimal contact. The methods have changed, but the psychological impact remains much the same. The mind, deprived of stimulation and connection, begins to break down. Both in the past and today, isolation is a tool of control, used to punish and erase. Visualizing the oubliette's design alongside the sterile lines of a modern solitary cell, the similarities are hard to ignore. The darkness and stone have given way to fluorescent lights and concrete. But the sense of abandonment remains. The experience of being forgotten, of knowing that no one will come, that your suffering is unseen, continues to haunt those subjected to these punishments. As we turn from the general horrors of the oubliette, The next chapter unfolds in the stories of those who endured them not just as criminals, but as political pawns, figures whose fates were shaped by the struggles for power within castle walls. Political prisoners faced a different kind of darkness inside these medieval dungeons. Oubliettes became instruments of erasure, used not just to punish, but to silence those who threatened the stability of the ruling order. Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire stands out as a prime example. Its reputation for cruelty was cemented by the fate of Richard II. After his capture by Henry Bolingbroke in 1399, Richard was quietly moved north and held in a cramped cell beneath the keep. The conditions were bleak: cold stone, stale air, and a sense of abandonment that pressed in from every side. Richard's fate remains uncertain. Some historians believe he starved to death, while others suggest he was murdered to ensure Bolingbroke's uncontested rise as Henry IV. In either case, the oubliette achieved its purpose. Richard's voice was silenced, and his presence erased from the political landscape. The use of oubliettes for political ends was not limited to kings. In 1311, King Edward II imprisoned his cousin, Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, along with 20 other rebels at Pontefract. Their confinement was brief and final. They were executed soon after. The dungeons acted as holding pens, stripping the condemned of even the small dignity of a public death. These spaces allowed rulers to deal with threats quietly, away from the scrutiny of the court or the public. The process was methodical: close the trapdoor, and the problem disappeared into the earth. Not all prisoners were highborn. For those without titles or influence, the oubliette offered no hope at all. Many were dropped into vertical shafts so narrow they could barely move, left to endure hunger, thirst, and sensory deprivation. Food and water, if given at all, were minimal. The darkness was complete. The stone walls trapped every sound, and the only company was the memory of life above, or at times the remains of previous captives. The slow decay of the body was matched by the unraveling of the mind. In rare cases, prisoners were found alive after years in these conditions, but survival brought little relief. Minds fractured by isolation rarely recovered. Chillingham Castle in Northumbria and St. Andrew's Castle in Fife, Scotland, both used oubliettes as tools of political control. At Chillingham, King Edward I imprisoned Scottish captives, soldiers, spies, even women and children. Many suffered broken limbs before being dropped through the trapdoor. Few survived for long, and the bodies of the dead were discarded without ceremony. At St. Andrew's, the infamous bottle dungeon was carved from solid rock. Its shape made escape impossible. David Stewart, Duke of Rothesay, died of starvation there in 1402, a victim of both political intrigue and the dungeon's unforgiving design. The architecture of these spaces was deliberate. Oubliettes were often sunk deep below castle floors, out of sight and out of mind. Some, like those at Pontefract, extended more than 30 feet underground. The intention was always the same: to remove a person from the world so completely that even their memory faded. The silence and darkness were not just features, they were the punishment itself. Sound, or the lack of it, played a role in the experience. The muffled voices of guards, the occasional clink of chains, and the distant echo of footsteps faded quickly, leaving prisoners in total quiet. The absence of stimulation heightened the sense of abandonment. For those above ground, the oubliette was simply a locked door. For those inside, time lost meaning and hope dissolved. These dungeons were not relics of a distant past. The strategy of isolating political threats, of using silence and invisibility as weapons, persists in different forms. The legacy of the oubliette is not confined to ruined castles. Its lessons reach forward, shaping how societies deal with those they seek to control or suppress. What happens to the mind when it is cut off from the world? The answer lies not only in the stories of those who endured the oubliette, but in the science that explains the effects of isolation. Centuries of punishment have shown that nothing tests the limits of the mind quite like isolation. The science of madness, as it relates to solitary confinement, reveals how the human brain depends on a continuous stream of sensory input and social contact to maintain stability. Oubliettes, with their total darkness and silence, created a perfect storm of deprivation. Modern solitary confinement, though different in appearance, produces the same psychological strain. In both cases, the results are disturbingly consistent. The mind, left without external anchors, begins to unravel. Psychologists now recognize that isolation is among the harshest punishments because it strikes at the core of what keeps us human. The brain is wired to seek patterns, interaction, and stimulation. When cut off from these, it compensates in unpredictable ways. In the pitch-black oubliette, prisoners often reported phantom sounds or fleeting glimpses of light, hallucinations born from a desperate need for sensory input. Paranoia and depression were common, as the absence of outside reality forced the mind inward, amplifying fears and distorting perceptions. The passage of time became impossible to track, leaving captives disoriented and detached from reality. Today, these symptoms are well documented in prisoners held in solitary cells. Researchers have identified a cluster of effects known as SHU syndrome, named after special housing units in modern prisons. Symptoms include hypersensitivity to noise, intrusive thoughts, emotional instability, and difficulty concentrating. These reactions are not limited to those with pre-existing mental health issues. Even resilient individuals can break down after extended periods of isolation. The lack of stimulation and social contact disrupts normal brain function, leading to anxiety, cognitive decline, and sometimes permanent psychological damage. The parallels between medieval and modern practices are not coincidental. Both environments were designed to strip individuals of agency and identity. In an oubliette, the absence of control was absolute. Prisoners had no say over their surroundings, no way to mark time, and no hope of changing their fate. Food arrived sporadically, dropped through a hole above, sometimes just enough to keep a person alive. The air was heavy with moisture and decay, and the silence pressed in from all sides. Modern solitary cells replace darkness with harsh artificial light, but the effect is similar: a rigid schedule, constant surveillance, and a world reduced to a few square meters. Studies have measured the long-term effects of such confinement. One found that individuals who spent time in solitary confinement faced a significantly higher risk of death after release, including from suicide and overdose. Symptoms like depression, anxiety, and memory loss often persisted long after the physical confinement ended. The absence of human contact and sensory variation erodes a person's sense of self. Inmates in solitary often report feeling dehumanized, reduced to a number, stripped of identity. Something as simple as the removal of mirrors in cells can deepen this effect, making it harder for prisoners to recognize themselves, both physically and psychologically. Historical shifts in penal philosophy have not erased the underlying logic of isolation. The 19th century saw solitary confinement promoted as a tool for reflection and reform, but the reality was far more damaging. The timeline stretches from medieval oubliettes designed for erasure, to Victorian prison cells built for introspection, to modern facilities where isolation is still used as punishment or control. The method has changed, but the outcome remains. Prolonged isolation undermines mental health and identity. Visualizing this progression, one can imagine the rough stone shaft of an oubliette morphing into the barred cells of early prisons, and finally into the sterile, white-walled boxes of today's solitary units. The essentials: enforced silence, restricted movement, and loss of autonomy persist. Brain scans of individuals exposed to long-term sensory deprivation show reduced activity in areas responsible for perception and memory, while stress-related regions become hyperactive. The science confirms what medieval jailers observed. Isolation does not reform, it dismantles. Sound design can help illustrate these effects. The imagined environment of an oubliette or solitary cell is filled with the echoes of a person's own heartbeat, the occasional drip of water, and the rising tide of internal noise as the mind searches for something, anything to hold on to. Over time, the distinction between real and imagined blurs. This auditory isolation, combined with the absence of physical contact, creates conditions ripe for psychological collapse. As awareness of these effects grows, the ethics of isolation as punishment come under greater scrutiny. The intention behind such confinement, whether to erase, control, or reform, must be weighed against the psychological cost. The legacy of oubliettes is not confined to history books. It continues to shape debates about punishment, mental health, and human rights. The story of oubliettes does not end with their disappearance from castles. Their influence lingers, challenging us to consider how much of their cruelty persists in the systems we use today. The story of oubliettes stretches beyond medieval stone and iron. Their presence in history is marked not only by their physical remains, but by the persistent imprint they left on cultural memory and modern systems of punishment. While physical structures have become rare, the idea of the oubliette, of a place designed to erase people from the world, continues to shape how societies think about isolation and control. At Chillingham Castle in Northumberland, the oubliette endures as a stark reminder of past cruelty. The chamber, carved deep into the castle's foundation, draws visitors intrigued by its reputation. Many who descend into its depths describe a heavy sense of unease, with some reporting chills or a lingering sadness that seems to hang in the air. Stories of apparitions and faint, unexplained sounds add to the atmosphere. But the true weight of the oubliette comes from its history as a site of suffering. The stone walls absorbed centuries of fear and despair, and today, they stand as silent witnesses to what people endured within them. Oubliettes have also found a place in literature and popular culture. Gothic novels often use them as symbols of hidden cruelty and unchecked power. Alexandre Dumas, in La Reine Margot, imagined them as the tools of ruthless rulers, while countless films and games have transformed these dungeons into dramatic settings for tales of betrayal and vengeance. The image of the oubliette, dark, narrow, and inescapable, captures the imagination because it reflects a primal fear, being abandoned and forgotten with no hope of rescue. Yet the reality was even starker than fiction. The horror of the oubliette lay not in elaborate traps or supernatural threats, but in the simple, relentless deprivation of light, sound, and human contact. The concept of enforced isolation did not remain in the past. Modern solitary confinement mirrors the essential features of the oubliette: a small, confined space, minimal sensory input, and a deliberate separation from all human interaction. In prisons around the world, solitary cells are used to punish or control, often with devastating psychological effects. Reports from inmates and research studies alike describe symptoms that echo those of medieval captives: hallucinations, anxiety, and a breakdown of identity. The parallels are hard to ignore, as the same methods of isolation produce similar outcomes across time. Beyond the walls of prisons, the legacy of the oubliette can be seen in the way society handles psychological isolation in the digital era. Social media and technology promise constant connection, yet many people experience profound loneliness despite or because of their online lives. The sensation of being surrounded by others but unable to reach true connection echoes the emotional emptiness inflicted by physical confinement. While the causes differ, the result is a sense of being cut off from meaningful interaction, left alone with one's thoughts in a virtual void. Growing awareness of the harm caused by isolation has led to calls for reform. The United Nations adopted the Nelson Mandela Rules in 2015, setting clear limits on the use of solitary confinement and recognizing its potential for lasting psychological damage. Human rights organizations now campaign against long-term isolation, arguing that it constitutes a form of psychological torture. These efforts reflect a broader understanding that the tools once used to erase people from history still exist, albeit in new forms, and that their effects remain just as destructive. Oubliettes have become historical sites, drawing visitors who wish to confront the past firsthand. Places like Chillingham or Leap Castle in Ireland allow people to see the cramped, airless chambers where prisoners once disappeared. Standing inside these spaces, the design becomes clear: every element intended to remove a person from the world above. The experience is unsettling, forcing visitors to consider the reality of life in such conditions, and to question what has truly changed in how societies treat those they wish to silence. Images of medieval dungeons blend with shots of modern solitary cells, revealing a disturbing continuity in the architecture of isolation. The sounds of heavy doors closing and footsteps fading into silence serve as reminders that, while the names and materials may differ, the purpose remains familiar. The psychological scars left by oubliettes are not just echoes from the past. They persist in the present, challenging us to recognize their influence in our own time. As we reflect on the forgotten legacy of the oubliette, we are left with a pressing question: what would it mean to endure such conditions ourselves? The next step is to imagine, in concrete detail, what it feels like to be completely cut off from the world, alone in darkness, with only your thoughts for company. Survival in total isolation is a test that reaches far beyond physical endurance. The psychological toll of solitary confinement, whether in a medieval oubliette or a modern cell, raises a pressing question. Could anyone truly withstand such conditions without profound consequences? The evidence, both historical and contemporary, suggests that the answer is rarely yes. Medieval oubliettes were constructed to deny prisoners the most basic human needs: light, sound, movement, and social contact. The design was intentional, stripping away every comfort until only the mind remained exposed and vulnerable. Today's solitary confinement cells mirror this intent. Inmates are confined for more than 22 hours a day, with little human interaction and minimal sensory stimulation. The cells are small, often no larger than a walk-in closet, and the monotony is broken only by the occasional clatter of a meal tray or the echo of footsteps in the corridor. Modern research into the effects of such isolation reveals a consistent pattern of psychological distress. The human brain is wired for interaction and variety. When deprived of these, it begins to malfunction. Studies using the Brief Psychiatric Rating Scale show that a significant number of individuals in solitary confinement develop symptoms of severe depression, anxiety, and paranoia. Many report hallucinations, hearing voices, seeing flashes of light, or feeling phantom sensations. These are not rare extreme reactions. They are common outcomes, even among people with no prior history of mental illness. The experience of time itself becomes distorted in isolation. Without natural light or social cues, days and nights blur together. Some prisoners lose track of how long they have been confined, overestimating or underestimating the passage of hours and days. This confusion feeds a sense of helplessness and despair. In both medieval and modern settings, the lack of control over one's environment deepens the psychological impact. The prisoner cannot choose when to eat, when to sleep, or even when to stand or sit. Every aspect of daily life is dictated by forces outside their control. Physical health suffers alongside mental health. In medieval oubliettes, prisoners often face starvation, dehydration, and exposure to unsanitary conditions. Today, solitary confinement is linked to weight fluctuations, skin irritations, and the worsening of chronic medical conditions. The lack of sunlight can lead to vitamin deficiencies, while poor air quality and hygiene contribute to a general decline in well-being. These physical hardships reinforce the sense of abandonment and loss of agency. The most profound effect of isolation, however, is the erosion of identity. Without meaningful contact or stimulation, prisoners begin to lose their sense of self. Qualitative interviews with individuals who have experienced solitary confinement describe a gradual fading of personality and memory. People speak of feeling invisible, as if they no longer exist, except as a number or a problem to be managed. This loss of identity is mirrored in accounts from the medieval era, where prisoners released from oubliettes often struggled to reintegrate into society, haunted by memories of their time in darkness and silence. The psychological consequences of isolation can persist long after release. Research shows that individuals who have spent time in solitary confinement face higher risks of suicide, substance abuse, and post-traumatic stress disorder. The damage is not easily undone. Even short periods of extreme isolation can leave lasting scars. The parallels with medieval oubliettes are unmistakable. Both environments are designed to break the spirit as much as the body, and both succeed with chilling efficiency. So, could you survive? The challenge is not simply enduring hunger or discomfort, but maintaining your grip on reality when every external anchor is removed. Most people are unprepared for the intensity of their own thoughts in the absence of distraction. The mind, deprived of input, turns inward, sometimes finding strength, but more often unraveling under the weight of fear and confusion. Some may last a day, a week, or even longer, but the cost is almost always more than anyone expects. Reflect on your own need for connection, routine, and meaning. The conditions that define the oubliette have not vanished. They continue to shape how societies punish and control. As we consider the true cost of isolation, it is worth questioning whether any purpose can justify its use. The enduring impact of isolation, across centuries and systems, forces us to confront difficult truths about punishment and humanity. Looking at the history of oubliettes and their modern counterparts, we see a pattern that persists through time. The deliberate use of isolation, whether through stone pits or sterile cells, serves as a method of control that goes far beyond physical punishment. Psychiatric experts, such as Dr. Stuart Gracian, have shown that solitary confinement can trigger severe psychological distress, even in those with no prior mental health issues. The parallels between medieval and modern practices prompt us to question the justification for such measures. As we recognize the similarities, we are left to consider how much of this calculated cruelty still shapes our systems today.